To share your screen, Rob, and
Okay.
yeah, once I've introduced you. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to another Friday afternoon and another online sport economics seminar. It's great to see so many of you here. It's a great pleasure to have Rob Simmons giving us a talk. Rob's been a regular throughout the year almost that we've been doing these online seminars, and so it's great to have Rob presenting from the Northwest, from Lancaster University, presenting work joint with Robbie and David Butler from University College Cork in Ireland on contracts, pay and performance in the sport of kings, evidence from horse racing, our first horse racing talk. As always, please do keep yourselves muted, ideally keep your webcams off for the time being, and put questions in the chat for the time being. Rob's got about an hour in which to talk, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So Rob, take it away.
Okay, let me see if I can bring this up. Can you see that?
Not yet. We're getting there. Yes, got it.
Okay, got it. Okay, thanks. By the way, I can't see the chat, so hopefully that will come through by other means. So I'll go back to the beginning. Okay, so as James said, this is joint work with Robbie Butler, David Butler from University College Cork, and we got our heads together a few years ago now. It's a while. It's taken a while to put the data set together and get the paper organized into a sort of suitable form. We think we're almost there now. So, as the title says, it's about horse racing, and it's essentially a labour stroke personnel paper looking at the type of contracts that horse race jockeys have in Britain. I'm conscious that the audience is very multinational today, so that's great. But it does mean that I'm going to have to explain a bit about UK horse racing and what it's all about and how it operates specifically. So I'll do that in the course of the talk. The results are, I think, reasonably straightforward, and there's no sort of heavy modelling involved here. It's actually a remarkably simple model, I have to say. So we'll get to that. So there aren't actually that many papers on horse racing within sports economics, and the academic papers on horse racing are largely devoted to betting, quite understandably, especially betting market efficiency and behavioral phenomena like the favourite long shot bias. Those have been explored massively within sports economics and also in general economics journals. So it seems to us that the product and labour market features of horse racing are actually under-researched and deserve some attention. So this paper is part of that. We're looking in particular how jockey pay and performance are aligned to contracts and incentives, and our focus is going to be on thoroughbred racing in Britain, and we're going to explore flat racing in particular. I'll explain what those are in a moment. We're not the first to do this. There's a paper that's actually quite widely cited within personnel economics by Sue Fernie and David Metcalf. It's not what you pay, it's the way that you pay it, and that's what gets results. It's a sort of a take on a, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Sorry. What do I do to get back?
We can still see it, Rob, so you may have gone to a different window on your computer, but we can still see your slides.
Yeah. Okay, you with me?
Yep, still got you.
Okay, thank you. Right, so what we're going to do is explore this relationship between jockey pay and performance in the context of flat racing. And there we are, we're off, literally as it were. That's how the race starts, with a group of horses lined up in the stalls, the stalls open automatically, and off the horses go on the race, ridden there by their jockeys. Now, there's two types of racing in Britain. National Hunt, which we have right now in the winter season, is with jumps. We're not going to consider that because we don't have comparable data for that type. Our data relate to flat racing, which, as it indicates, involves no hurdles, no jumps. The races vary in ground conditions, mostly turf, some all weather, and they vary a lot in distance, between 0.5 and 3 miles. And the flat race season is roughly between April to October. There are exceptions either side. Now, a quick word of comparison here with the United States for our American colleagues. As far as I can tell, and I have been to some American racetracks, horse racing in US tends to be on dirt, and tends to be on a more sort of uniform distance than what we have in Britain. The dominant mode in Britain is on turf, and that's important because having the races on turf means that you can have quite different ground conditions according to the weather. And there is some skill for the jockeys in managing the horses under different conditions, which can vary between sort of heavy, like we've had recently with a lot of rain, and hard or firm when there's been no rain. And the races also vary considerably in prize money. The most prestigious race in the flat race season would be the Epsom Derby, run in June. That's sort of on a level, if you like, with the Kentucky Derby in the United States. So to be a jockey, to be a professional jockey, you need to have a license, and that license comes from the British Horse Racing Authority. And to do that, to get that, you need to have completed some courses, some formal courses at a designated British racing school. And then, for the purposes of this paper, we're going to compare performances of jockeys of two categories. The retained means they are hired by a trainer and or owner with exclusive right on the jockey's services, and they have an employment contract, which is typically annual and renewable. The non-retained group, which is the majority, the overwhelming majority, are freelance. They're self-employed, and I'll explain how they get earnings in a moment. So those are the main two categories. There are other categories, sort of on the fringes. The apprentices, trainees, if you like, are working their way towards a license. Now, in horse racing in Britain, there are weight allowances and handicaps in many races, which will amuse you if you're interested in outcome uncertainty. The whole point about handicapping is to create some outcome uncertainty within a given race or given set of races. And with that, the saddle has extra weight for some of the horses, those horses that have actually won previously and generated some strong form. Well, the apprentice gets a discount on that and is carrying lower weight compared to their sort of fully fledged professional counterparts. And finally, there are occasionally races featuring amateurs, non-professional jockeys. So it's really those categories that I want to focus on for this paper. So what happens? Well, the jockey gets earnings as follows. They get a riding fee, which is a per race flat rate fee, plus some proportion of the prize money. And if they're very fortunate, if they're one of a small group of elite jockeys, they might be hired by a prominent owner and or trainer on what we call a retainer contract which is essentially an employment contract. A quick word on how the prize money is generated. This comes from sponsors, and the sponsor will typically have their name on the race. So the race will carry the sponsor's name, and the sponsors very often include bookmakers. This is a sport which is driven hugely by betting, and the bookmakers get revenues from horse race betting, mostly online. And by the way, maybe this is not the same in the United States, but in Britain, horse race betting is still the highest, the largest source of bookmaker revenues. And you might sort of be thinking, well, how's that the case? Surely it ought to be football. Well, that's because of the sheer number of horse races and horse race meetings that we have in Britain. There is racing every day in Britain apart from Christmas Day, pretty much, subject to weather conditions. So there's a lot of betting going on, obviously huge opportunities to bet, and the bookmaker revenues are ploughed back into prize money, and then the race title will carry the bookmaker's name, like the Bet365 Sprint. And to give you a feel for the product market here, the leading bookmakers in Britain are William Hill, Ladbrokes, and the Irish firm Paddy Power. But alongside those, we have an important role for Betfair, which is a betting exchange, not a bookmaker. And actually, to be confusing, is jointly owned by the company that owns Paddy Power. The average prize money per flat race on turf is £20,000. For all weather, this is sort of lower level racing, lower category, lower quality usually. So the average prize money is less on the all weather tracks, 9,000 average per race. So the jockeys, first of all, are going to get a riding fee for turning up. So for each race they run, they get a fee, and that chart tracks the growth of the riding fee from 2000 to 2019, sort of rising steadily and ending up at £127 per race. Get a feel for this. You should also see the component which is linked to prize money itself. The jockeys get 6.9% of the prize money for winning for any race. So clearly the winner of the Epsom Derby is going to do very well for themselves. So the total earnings then, prize money plus the riding fee. A typical race card in Britain has 7 races. It is conceivable that a jockey might ride in all 7, in which case they would get £890. And that's regardless of any winnings they get. So to give you a feel for that, Luke Morris earned more than £180,000 per year in 2017 and 2018. He rode of the order of 1,500 horses in total, and he's a really active jockey. Now, before you think that doesn't sound too bad, you have to offset some costs here, which are very substantial. These involve travel, and insurance, an agent's fee. The PJA is the Professional Jockeys Association, so there's a membership fee for that, 8%. There are valet fees. So there's a lot of costs involved. And to flip it around, supposing you turn up to one racetrack to race at the 3:30 in Ludlow on a Wednesday afternoon, and I use that as an example because I've actually seen this happen. The jockey might turn up for just that one race. And then when I asked this particular jockey, well, why are you doing that? He said, well, I'm off to another race course soon after. And then he added, well, I'm fairly new to all this. I'm working my way up. The more meetings I go to, the more races I run. the more I'll get noticed, and then my agent can get me some more rides. So for younger jockeys, they are actually willing to do it that way, which sounds like hard graft to me. So prize money will depend on many factors, such as obviously the ability of the horse, luck in the race, and so on. But it might depend to some extent on the jockey's skill. So there's a whole lot of factors coming into play, determining the jockey's earnings. And there you've got some examples of some really high-profile jockeys. These are the elite end of the spectrum, and they're actually going to be featuring in the retained jockey data set, or part of the data set that we have. Ryan Moore, Jim Crowley, Frankie Dettori. Frankie Dettori is a veteran, over 50 years old now. He's the oldest guy in the sample. And you'll see, I mean, those are very good strike rates, actually, over 20% there. And then we've noted second, third, fourth, and we've noted the prize money component. Those are the total winnings attributed to the horses that the jockey rode. And then we've figured out the prize money element of the jockey's pay and the riding fees. And then actually these guys get a retainer on top of that. And these are slightly or somewhat less lucrative earnings down the ladder. Jason Hart, Etzeni, and Donaghy there. So for a run-of-the-mill jockey, pay or earnings of the order of £30,000 to £40,000 per year is quite normal. And to illustrate the huge inequality of earnings, we plotted the Lorentz curve for jockey earnings, and the Gini coefficient is an astonishingly high 0.9. I'm not used to seeing anything quite so high as that. If you look at team sports, for example, professional footballers, basketball players, stuff like that, we're looking at 0.3, 0.4 per team, something like that. So the theory behind our paper is drawn from an established literature on performance-related pay. And within that, the argument that performance pay has the capability to overcome moral hazard in a principal agent setting. And a famous paper which illustrates this very well is Ed Lazier's AER 2000 paper, famous study for windscreen fitters in the US, showing that switching the fitters voluntarily from hourly rates of pay to payments based on piece rate performance produced greater levels of productivity. This was piece rate contract with a guaranteed minimum pay. There would be an incentive effect attached to that. There was a productivity improvement when this scheme was introduced, when the piece rate was introduced, but half of the productivity improvement was due to sorting, which in the paper was shown by the addition of worker fixed effects in the productivity regressions. And from that very same paper, this is a reasonable way of showing the theory. There you have some indifference curves. You have a comparison between an hourly wage, which is fixed, and the piecework with guarantee, the upward sloping schedule. And the piecework with guarantee has the potential to raise worker utility and also raise firms' profits. So that's essentially the theory that we're working with. A few sort of quick connections to other sports. Much attention has been made in terms of incentives to tournament theory and to sports tournaments, especially golf, tennis, and running. And we've had some papers in this series which have looked at that. The key proposition is that a larger prize spread generates greater effort although that assumes identical ability. And there's a famous paper in the JPE, Ehrenberg-Boniano, on the golf tour in the US. And then an extension to consider player heterogeneity by Uwe Sunde on tennis players. And then a whole load of papers, which Bernd Frick is part of, on road running with prize incentives and runner selection being considered there. Now, when we look at contracts, and this is relevant to what we're going to show, players might have strategic behavior in effort. They might raise effort just before contract renewal and reduce effort just after contract renewal. So there's a group of papers which look at this in team sports, in NBA. Berry and Krautmann is an example there. The results depended very much on which productivity measure was being used. And their preferred measure, there was no evidence of shirking. And paper, Bernd Frick and myself with Tundi Baraimo, looked at German Bundesliga in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy. We found that players with longer contract length remaining had better performances as measured by Kicker journalist ratings. So this whole sort of shirking argument has been considered at great length in many sports papers in several settings. So what about jockeys? Is it possible that the jockeys might somehow withhold their effort? Well, I've noted already that it's a joint result. We've got jockeys and horses delivering a combined performance, and it's hard to separate out the jockey performance from the horse performance. So a jockey could make excuses for bad performance. The horse didn't like the trip, that refers to the distance. The distance may not have been appropriate for the horse's physique and conditioning. The going was too hard or too soft, that refers to ground conditions. And that is actually true that horses are sensitive, thoroughbred horses are sensitive to the ground conditions to some extent. I couldn't get the horse to respond, so the jockey had the horse lined up for a late surge to the finishing line, and it didn't happen, the horse didn't kick on. These are all plausible excuses. So Fernie and Metcalf in their paper argued that retained jockeys, the jockeys on the annual contract, might be prone to shirking. And that actually triggered our interest in the research here. Now, Fernie and Metcalf published their paper in 1999. Their data are from the 1990s. They had limited data on retained jockeys and on their performances. So the evidence they produced in the paper was descriptive, not econometric. They only had 7 retained jockeys. They only had 25 jockey season observations for the retained jockeys. So what they offer in the paper is actually a descriptive table. And they argued that jockey rankings typically got worse after the jockeys got the retainer status, after signing a lucrative retainer contract. And they looked at cardinal measures as well, which I'm going to go into in a moment, and argued that these were not improving and not superior for the retained jockeys compared to the mass of jockeys on regular performance pay scheme. So we're going to move this forward with a larger data set with several more observations than Fernie and Metcalf had. Now, another paper to note on this, Coffey and Maloney had the neat idea of comparing prize levels in horse racing with greyhound racing, where there's obviously no jockey at all. The dog just races around the track chasing this mechanical rabbit, whereas horse racing has got the human element. And comparing the two sports, Coffey and Maloney argued that horses with the jockey on board were sensitive in their performances to levels of prize money as opposed to greyhound racing. I should say something about the owners and who these are, who's offering the retainers. Well, these are wealthy individuals and families, syndicates, and especially recently, Middle Eastern sheikhs and royal families. And very few owners actually earn profits from horse racing. Horse racing itself is a very labor-intensive and expensive activity, requiring stable staff, vets, and insurance. So the costs do rack up. And the substantial literature in sports economics has gone down the line of proposing utility maximization, including the prestige and thrill of appearing in the winner's enclosure. So off to our data then. What do we actually do? We've got 20 seasons of flat racing in Britain from 2000 to 2019. The data are aggregated to season level, not race level, which would be far too complicated. We have 227 different jockeys, 7 retaining owners, and 17 retained jockeys. The retained jockeys, once they get that status, tend in our sample to stay retained for quite some time, usually. I mean, some disappear after a couple of years, but many of them keep the status for a long time. The data were hand collected. There's no sort of easily accessible website for this. There's a wonderful data source called the Racing Post, which, believe it or not, is a daily newspaper devoted to horse racing. As you can imagine, this is primarily servicing the betting community. So the audience for this newspaper is essentially gamblers. And this is published pretty much every day. And it's got an archive. And the archive is fantastic, but it would need wonderful web scraping skills to extract the detailed information. So do jockey earnings correlate with performance? And do retained jockeys earn more prize money for their retainer owner than compared to freelance? That's going to be our basic research question here. To be a retaining owner, this is kind of your characteristics. You're going to be in the top 10 of the Racing Post total earnings for British flat and all-weather racing at least 3 times between 2000 and 2019. You will have generated more than £1 million in prize money on average for at least 3 seasons within our sample period. And you'll have a network of trainers, and those trainers will operate a large number of horses, thoroughbred horses, 200 runners per season, something like that. Now, we're going to make inferences here without actually knowing the full value of the retainer contract, because that's private. It's not publicly revealed. Upwards of £1 million per year, but we really don't know. And we have searched hard for this, but we haven't got there. We also don't know the earnings of the jockeys outside Britain. And you spotted before that the flat race season in Britain is summer. Well, what do the jockeys do outside of that? And one answer is they go somewhere else, Dubai or Australia. And they also go to France and Ireland. The retained jockey does still get the share of prize money over and above the retainer contract, but what does seem to be clear is that for the retained jockey, the power of performance-related incentive pay is reduced. So we're going to figure out some regressions for some dependent variables, which are going to be total prize money, total pay for the jockey, and riding fees. And we'll also show regressions for wins and strike rate. A useful feature of our data is that some jockeys go into retainer contracts and some leave retainer contracts. 9 jockeys actually leave the retainer contract position to become freelance again. So we can bite on that in the analysis in a way that's kind of unusual in personnel economics. Normally, papers on performance-related pay show you movement into performance-related pay or out of performance-related pay, but not double switching in and out. So two-way switching is covered in our analysis. Sample size 1,283. As I said, the overwhelming majority of jockeys are on freelance terms, and to recall what that was, they're earning riding fees plus 6.9% of the prize money. An additional point is that there's some weight attached to what we call place prize money. If you're second, third, or fourth, you get 3.9% of the prize money attached to a place. So obviously that's going to be considerably smaller than for winning. Now, we're going to control for an underlying productivity measure. The racing research measure used in Fernie and Metcalfe's original paper attempts to find the jockey contribution to the horse performance independent of the horse ability. Each jockey-horse combination gets a rating, and the calibration is such that it's scaled so that the performance measure has a mean of 10. 2 jockeys in our sample, and I'm showing there some kind of a cut of the data for these 2 jockeys, Atzeni and Hannigan, and I'm showing their racing research measures for selected years, and Hannigan is just under 10, which is, as I said, that's the mean here, whereas Atzeni is just above 10 for selected seasons. So just a bit more on how this works. The racing research algorithm, drilling away behind the scenes there, assesses the performance of both jockeys and horses. Each horse gets a rating based on their performance within a race, and there's an update from past performance. So this is something which is reviewed through the season and then can be aggregated to the season. So ratings in previous races can be revised up and down according to new information. What the algorithm does is to compare a given jockey with other jockeys riding the same horse. And this is repeated, it's summed, it's a double summation really. For a given horse, we're summing over all the other jockeys that rode that horse, and there may well be a few. And then we're summing over all the horses that Jockey X rode in a given season. So racing research extracts the contribution of a given jockey to performances of all horses ridden in a season. So this is underlying productivity. It pays no attention, this measure, to prize money. So a jockey might overperform on a horse according to the indicator here, but not actually finish in the places and win any prize money for the owner. So this is algorithm based. We don't actually see, we're not given access to the underlying calculations in this algorithm. So we don't see how it's ground out. We just get the final output. But it is widely regarded within the industry. An alternative, by the way, would be time form ratings, which are based on, as the name implies, by speed. So it's 10 for each year. There's the median, standard deviation, minimum, you typically sort of 5, 6, maximum 12, 13, no more than 14. Okay, now I'm going to go to the results. So I'll embed the model with the results. 5 dependent variables: log pay, log riding fees, log prize money, log wins, and strike rate. Each model has got jockey fixed effects for unobserved heterogeneity, and each regression has standard errors clustered by jockey. 17 retained jockeys in the sample. So here we go then. First of several tables. So racing research is the underlying productivity measure that delivers a positive and significant coefficient. This is total pay, combining the riding fee element with the prize money element. Retainer status, dummy variable for 1 for each year. The retained jockey has retainer contract within the sample period, positive and significant throughout. And then 2 extra variables are included. Before retainer is a dummy variable for the 3 years of a retained jockey before they actually got retained. So we're looking here as a kind of signal of quality. The 3 years is arbitrary, and we'll relax that later on. And after retainer denotes dummy variable 1 for each year after the jockey gives up a retainer contract and returns to a freelance contract. Now, in that table, the coefficient is positive but imprecisely estimated. So that's the first. Now, we don't expect much from this regression because this is log riding fees. Obviously, this is proportional to the number of rides. Again, the underlying productivity measure has positive and significant coefficient. So more productive jockeys actually get more rides, which seems to us to be sensible. But here the retainer status is no longer significant. Neither is before retainer, neither is after retainer. So contractual status has no effect on the amount of riding fees that the jockeys generate for themselves, and that seems reasonable. Whereas if we take the prize money component, again, the underlying productivity measure has positive significant coefficient. Retainer dummy, positive and significant. And if you look at the last column, before retainer, this is up to 3 years before getting the retainer contract, positive and significant. After retainer, also positive and significant. So it does seem as if retained jockeys during, before and after are delivering more prize money for the owners than, and for themselves of course, than the freelance jockeys. So that for us is quite an important result. And going back to the shirking story, which is covered in the Fernie and Metcalf study, we don't seem to be finding any evidence in support of any shirking here. Looking further, we've got wins. This is log of wins. Again, the underlying productivity measure has positive significant coefficient. In the last column, although not the earlier ones, retainer status has positive significant coefficient. Before retainer, positive significant again, and after retainer, positive but not precisely estimated. There's relatively fewer observations for after retainer compared to before retainer, so smaller sample with after retainer equals 1 is perhaps driving that result. And this is strike rate. Now, what that is number of wins divided by number of rides. And this might be, if you like, a better measure of performance. It's wins per ride. Positive and significant coefficient of the underlying productivity measure again. Retainer status, positive and significant. Before retainer, positive, significant. After retainer, positive and significant as well. So again, we are seeing that the retained jockeys are generating better strike rates, more wins per ride. Now, just as a kind of add-on, this is not in the paper, by the way, we looked at what would happen to our model if we simply took out the before retainer, because obviously before the jockey gets hired on retainer, we won't know who these retained jockeys are, although it would be not too difficult to work through the list of jockeys and their performances and hazard a very good guess as who these jockeys might be. But just for sake of argument, we don't know. And what we find there is that broadly retained status still retains its positive significant coefficient, but we lose significance on post-retainer effect through that. So the post-retainer effect really belongs jointly with the before retainer effect. We also So since we arbitrarily categorized before retainer as 3 years before getting the retainer contract, we looked at relaxing that into 2 years, 4 years, and all years before. The before retainer does not work in significance all years before and 4 years before. It works, as we've shown, for 3 years before, and it works again for 2 years before. Now, the reason for this is that we think 4 or more years before, the elite jockeys are not properly developed in terms of their ability and their form and their experience. 3 years turns out to be the right cutoff that you can reasonably infer that these jockeys are going to make excellent career progress. A lot of attention is made right now, looking at the up and coming jockeys, who's going to make it. And there's always a lot of discussion inside the industry of who the next big name jockey is going to be, a bit like football players, I suppose. At the bottom there, we've performed some F-tests to see if these coefficients are statistically significantly different from each other. And the one that stands out under the 3 years heading is retainer equals before retainer. The coefficient equality hypothesis is rejected. And indeed, it seems what we have then is a kind of step function. You go from freelance, the period when you're being talked about as a retainer candidate, and then getting the retainer contract. It's a kind of a step function. And this also repeats the change in category of before retainer, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and all years before. Here, the 4 years does end up significant for the strike rate. Since the strike rate is a proportion, it might be argued that OLS is not the appropriate estimator. So just to reassure ourselves, we did a generalized linear model estimation, and we got actually exactly the same results. So nothing changed there. So we have a step function in prize money from the F-tests, the freelance, then before retainer, then retained. Before retainer is not significant in the prize money regression at 4 years. We argue it's too early at that stage to identify the potential elite jockeys. There's a larger effect of before retainer on prize money for 2 years relative to 3. The effects of retainer are still significant if we drop the before retainer dummy. So it looks like performance matters for jockey earnings and for the owner's prize money. We further found the ordinal rank was significantly better for retained jockeys over non-retained. So there's an official classification of jockeys. There's a champion jockey at the end of the season, and below that there's a ranking of the jockeys. And there's a lot of sorting going on here, which we've not delved into because we're not at race level. The sorting is essentially the matching of the jockey to a good horse that's likely to win a race. And that's more likely to happen with a trainer with wealthy owners. So we don't find any evidence that jockeys shirk when on retainer contracts. The prize money won by retained jockeys is significantly greater, suggesting that owners broadly hire the best jockeys on retainer contracts, and the selection process is surely more than luck. But interestingly, on leaving the retainer contract, the elite jockeys get significantly more prize money than regular freelancers. There's a kind of legacy effect going on here. We think this is to do with networking. These jockeys have established a network of contacts through experience with trainers, and even though they've not got the retainer contract, they're still getting really good rides with potential to win races. So what's happening in this sport? How are our results so different to Fernie and Metcalf? Well, Fernie and Metcalf's results refer to an earlier era where new owners were coming in. They were inexperienced. The Arab sheikhs and princes had just arrived into Britain, taking an interest into horse racing. This is an early stage in their development as owners. They learned how to manage jockey and trainer allocations over time. So I hesitate to sort of give you a Moneyball type interpretation here, but there is no doubt that horse racing has featured a growth of technical expertise over the last 20 years. And thinking of the sort of principal agent problem for the owners, what the owners have done is to hire racing managers who are like sporting directors or directors for football or general managers. And these racing managers are responsible for forming the retainer contracts, managing the trainer group, managing the stable network. So there's an extensive network of stables going on here, which are linked together and compartmentalized under various high-profile, big-name trainers. There's a lot more can be done here. An interesting direction is the rise of female jockeys. Has there been hiring discrimination in the past? Quite likely, yes. One would think that female jockeys have an advantage in horse racing in terms of being relatively light and supple. Well, that's gradually changing. Women riders are getting better horses to ride and are making good progress compared to an astonishingly low level from before. Vanessa Cashmore at University of Liverpool is doing a PhD on that subject, so that's interesting. Many of the jockeys working in British horse racing are actually Irish. There's an influx of Irish jockeys and trainers into British horse racing. What does that do to the British talent pool, and what's going to happen with that after Brexit? Thirdly, there's a strong role for family networks in British horse racing. It's rather like performing arts. It seems to help to have family relatives support you in your early jockey career, and several jockeys are actually related to trainers and owners. Then there's the potential for successful job matches between trainers and jockeys. How do these develop, and could there be assortative matching in jockey-trainer pairs? So that's all I have. Delighted to receive any questions. But the conclusion is, it is what you pay that makes the difference, and that's what gets results. So we've kind of overturned Fernie and Metcalfe's study, but we're working with a different era, perhaps. And there's Frankie Dettori jumping off his horse after winning a race, which is something he typically does when he wins.
Okay, thanks very much, Rob. Well, one thing that I can do straight away is make use of the new ways of responding. So you, more than just raise your hand in Teams now, you can applaud. So there's some applause for you, Rob.
Oh, that's nice.
Don't know if you can see it, but some Teams applause for you. Thank you very much. That was a really, Dennis has given you some applause too. We can now move to a time of Q&A, and Peter has a question in the chat where he says, have you considered including experience and experience squared as a comparison in your wage equations?
Actually, we should have, shouldn't we? We should look at that. That's a really good point, and I like the idea of the squared term. There's a lot of variation in ages. It is, as Frankie Dettori shows, there's potential for a long-lasting career in this. On the other hand, there's also potential for burnout. Many of the younger jockeys do burn out pretty quickly. And of course, there's the whole stress of keeping your weight down with this sport, which is really demanding. That's a really interesting idea. Yes, we should do that. We haven't done so far, no.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Peter. Then Bernd has got his hand up.
Rob, so far you have told a monitoring story. So the principal invests in controlling the agent. The owner invests in controlling the jockey. What about the career concern story? So even if the jockeys lose their retainer contract, they are still interested in getting access to the better horses. And that requires being successful, even if you are not on a retainer contract anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's not just monitoring then. No, I think that's absolutely right. You need to maintain your success I mean, this is a very competitive labour market. There are plenty of aspirant jockeys wanting to take over your rides. So yes, it can be ruthless. I think that's a strong point. That is a good interpretation. Yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Bernd. And then Stefan had his hand up as well.
Hi, Rob. I think you probably can guess what I'm going to say, but I got a couple of points actually. But to take up Bernd's point about the career concerns, I think career concerns is clearly a relevant part of this. But yeah. I have to say, I've waged a campaign against this for years. I really wish people in sports would stop talking about shirking. You're taking this from principal agent literature. You mentioned people like Holmstrom. If you read the Holmstrom articles, if you go back to the original Ross articles, if you read this literature, the whole setup is based on a principal who wants an agent to complete a task and cannot see what the agent is doing. And therefore a fixed payment to the agent gives the agent no incentive without monitoring. And that's your Safelight story. That makes sense. The owner, the manager of the company, the owner of the company cannot watch the windscreen people putting in the windscreens, cannot monitor how effectively they're doing it. So it makes complete sense to move to piece rates rather than working on a fixed hourly wage. What we're talking about with horse racing and almost any sport is completely a different situation where what's happening is that the agents who are employed by the principals are conducting they're doing their work completely in the open, subject to large amounts of information being spread across the entire market. So not only, and as Bernd points out, they're making effort. They have incentives to make their effort because their effort is being noticed. Everybody can see how hard they're trying. And then that then translates at a later stage in their career to promotions or better rides or whatever it might happen to be. So that's the whole point of a complete information scenario. You don't need, you could pay these people fixed piece rates, fixed hourly wages. It wouldn't make any difference because if you saw them shirking, as you call it, then they would lose their rides. And I'm sure there are many retained riders who have lost their rides precisely because the people retaining them said, well, you don't seem to be trying very hard anymore. So I just wish, and this is not just a case of horse racing. It's just not just your paper. It's everyone who talks about shirking, whether you're talking about it in football or soccer or basketball or anything. There is no shirking going on. These people are playing their hearts out. And the point is, you can see it. It's plain as in your nose. Now, I grant you there's some question about training, and that's been an issue that's been raised in the literature. But even then, with jockeys, we know these blokes and men and women have to achieve extraordinary physical feats to get to the weights. They are weighed so that we know exactly how much work they've been putting into keeping their weight down. So again, the idea that they're shirking on this seems to me to be completely crazy. So that's my speech on shirking. So the other point I wanted to make was I really think you should, in the paper, you should give some concern to the welfare of the horse. The damn horse is doing a lot of work, and I'm worried about the one way in which we might think about the behavior of the agents, and this might have something to do with performance, is maybe when you get retained, you're being pressed by the owners of the horses to push the horses to perform. And we know these horses are regularly shot for the slightest injury. There's a huge horse meat industry going on, and so I think, and I'm not sure how this works out, but I think you should give some concern to the welfare of the damn horse.
Thanks, Stefan. Those are really interesting points. Of course, the welfare, that would take us into a different paper. Yeah, I mean, yes, indeed, this is dangerous for the horses. Less dangerous for flat racing than for national hunt, though, where I think that's where you get most of the injuries because of the sheer difficulty of, climbing these steep fences that are often in place. But even with flat racing, yes, there is a possibility of serious injury, going lame and that kind of thing. So yes, that's a concern. The shirking argument, no, I'm not going to agree with you, Stefan. You can probably expect that. I wish I could go back into the archives and show you a tape or two from a couple of years ago with Mesut Ozil playing for Arsenal, which to me was a kind of and this got called out on national TV. Not by me. I'm not an Arsenal fan, so it's I have no stake in it. So there are several examples like that, and you can go through various sports. I'm sure our American colleagues can find a few as well for their sports. So I take the point there is a lot of observation. Yes, indeed, and that observation has got increasingly sophisticated. But if there was no shirking, how come there are so many sports psychologists out there helping out sports teams and so on? So I think there is a potential problem.
That's not about shirking. I mean, so it might be about confidence. It might be about, I mean, again, I just appeal to you, look at the literature. Go read Holmstrom, read Ross, read the setup. What you're talking about is ad hocery. It's not really based in what's in the theory. Go look at the theory and see what the theorists said their setup of the model is, and ask yourself, does what the situation you're observing, does it fit the setup? Rather than going into some extraneous thing about, well, what about this, what about that? Look at the theory and see if your model is actually reflecting anything about what the theorists said would be happening.
Fair enough. I think we're going to differ on that one.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. In the meantime, you can look after the welfare of your cat as well.
Yeah, that's too right.
But before moving to the next set of hands up, Peter Dawson put a question in the chat, which was, is there a role to be played by the crowd? Could it affect both jockeys and horses?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, the crowd is so remote from the race. I mean, this is, imagine a 2-mile race. You're going around the track twice, perhaps. Out there in the back straight, you're not going to be conscious of the crowd. And I think there's been discussion of this with COVID, and we have racing behind closed doors now. I think that the jockeys are saying that it makes no difference.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Peter, for the question. Then I think in terms of ordering, Enya was up, and then it was Wayne, then Robbie. So Enya first.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned several times the importance of the weight of the jockeys. They are putting extended effort into maintaining a certain weight. So I'm curious about that. So I'm into show jumping, a different kind of horse riding competition, and in this competition, it's never really an issue regarding the weight of the riders. Even though the horses are required to jump quite high obstacles and fences, these kinds of competitions. So is there any actual evidence for the weight of the jockeys significantly impacting the performance and the ability of the horses to run?
That would be difficult, because I think we would find that the weights are very similar across the jockeys for a given race. And the other complication is the handicapping system, where successful horses previously get given a higher weight in the saddle. So the weight is actually the jockey plus the saddle. And through that, that's the kind of, if you like, the measure to create more outcome uncertainty in the race. So there are official weights recorded. It would be an interesting exercise for someone, hopefully not me, to kind of I mean, you can do this. You can get the weights. They are recorded in the Racing Post, and figure out, for example, whether the top weight horse actually won the race under given conditions. So yes, that's an interesting research exercise. Sounds like one for a PhD student, though.
Yeah, I just thought if the weight plays such an important role, and if we are looking at the performance of the jockey, that maybe this physical aspect might play. But if they are all the same weight,
I mean, I think the interesting thing here is that very often the top weight horse, perhaps because it's been successful previously, the horse carrying the most weight actually wins the race. So despite this kind of equilibrating mechanism that the handicapper tries to put into place, it doesn't necessarily work. If the horse and jockey are good enough, the horse will win anyway.
Yeah. I imagine it doesn't make much of a difference for a 500-kilo horse or a 600-kilo horse if there's 1 kilo more or less in the saddle.
That's right. Although that's heavily dependent on ground conditions, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, so Wayne next.
Yeah, so Rob, the setup is really great. Going into a retainer from freelance and then out of retainer, back to freelance. That's really nice to see. I also want to comment on that Lazier paper. The Lazier paper that kind of is some of your main motivation is just purely effort. There's just no skill involved in those tasks. So it's a pure effort paper. It's also, unlike what Stefan said, it's easily observable. So they can observe the behavior. So it's a pure effort paper. It's also easily observable. And so moving away from that example of motivating, piece rates is really important. So the question I have really is about the small number of retainers you've got. It's just 17, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one's about the small number. The other question is really just about, selection. To me, that's kind of the question. I mean, basically, are we just talking here about the superstars? These are the absolute top performers, and do they pretty much become the retainers? And then, as such, have they somehow really displayed kind of their all-out behavior with enough time and performance? So I guess that's kind of the, given your analysis and things, that's, what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think we're heading in that direction, that these are elite jockeys who performed extraordinarily well. And this is, a contract well worth having. This is going to elevate your earnings by hundreds of thousands of pounds. So I think there's something in what you're saying. And yes, it's a small number because this is the preserve of a small number of elite owners who are willing to shell out these large sums of money. An ordinary owner wouldn't have that kind of financial resource available.
Yeah, so I guess my question really is, are they basically all the superstars? Are there freelancers who are, significantly above the retainers in terms of performance, or basically is this the LeBron Jameses of the, of the jockeys?
I think the interesting question here is the timing. At what point do you become a really elite jockey? I think it's a bit more gradual than that. Although you get the elite status for performing really well, you cement that status during the retainer contract, perhaps. Then you become Frankie Dettori-like, one of the really top jockeys and household name, if you want. But I'm not sure you get that household name status before you get the retainer. I don't know if that answers the point at all. I'm hesitant because I'm not sure, how I would get a handle on when you get that superstar elite type status.
Right. Well, from the American context, you get drafted, you play in a team, you become a free agent, and then, you know, all that. So interesting to think about the sequencing of those and how the career concerns play out.
Right. I think that would take us into a kind of a different analysis, because we would need to capture the popularity and the aspects of superstardom, you know, what makes you a household name, that kind of thing. But I think tracking the timing of that would be interesting. Initially, it's all about winning races, getting the retainer contract and getting noticed. But as you're hinting, as you're suggesting, there's a bit more to it than that in terms of raising your profile. So yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not totally sure how to do it analytically, I must admit.
Okay, thanks, Wayne. And then Robbie.
Thanks, James. It was just on a comment earlier about shirking. A couple of people said it. I mean, the idea that shirking doesn't happen, like, it's sort of naive to believe that. I mean, it's almost known to happen. So much so that there's a non-trier rule. So there's actually legislation that if a jockey is seen not to try, this rule is invoked. But there was at least 4 jockeys last season that were suspended under the non-trier rule. And this happens consistently season after season, where jockeys could get anything from 2 weeks to a number of months suspension for not trying. I mean, taken to the extreme, there's a famous case where Kieran Fallon, who is actually one of our retained jockeys in the sample, was taken to the High Court in the UK for alleged race fixing. Now, the trial did collapse, so the case was never proven. But there is constant and ongoing monitoring of this phenomena. And because jockeys are pretty regularly suspended because of it, it's pretty obvious that shirking is an issue and something that needs to be monitored all the time.
Thanks, Robbie. I think Stefan's desperate to jump back in.
Yes.
Oh, here we go.
Well, I wouldn't say desperate, but I mean, sorry, that is severe provocation. So the point is, sure, it's possible in a complete information situation. It's not that people in a complete information situation would prefer not to supply effort. Our working assumption is that people would prefer not to supply effort under all circumstances. The point is that the shirking model that was being referred to as a theoretical basis for these contracts is a model based on incomplete information, where effort is not observable. And as you just made the point very, very clearly and very, very straightforwardly to all of us, it is absolutely observable, and it's so observable that if you can actually take somebody to court because you saw them not making the effort. So that clearly invalidates the use of the shirking model in terms of as a theoretical foundation. This is not so. This is the whole point about this. This is about what is a valid theoretical foundation for this analysis, and that shirking is not the valid theory. There might be other theories that you could bring into this, but shirking is not the one.
Rob, do you want to?
No,
Can I come back in, or
go on, Robbie? Yeah.
So I would disagree. The whole point is it is not observable. That's the whole point. That when you see a jockey riding a horse, and I somebody that watches horse racing regularly, it's almost impossible to know whether they're trying or not. And I think that is the crux of the issue, and I think that's the reason we're having this tennis match.
Well, so I mean, it'd be good to have the chat function working so we could continue in the chat. So I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but you said it's observable because you said it could go to court. That's the point. If it's not observable, it couldn't go to court at all, right? You couldn't be fired for not making effort, as you said. You said people are fired for not making effort. So clearly, it's observable. That's the point.
Well, I think the fact that the case collapsed says an awful lot.
Well, the case could collapse for a number of reasons, right? And one reason was it was determined that the guy was making effort, and there was no the evidence was not sufficient. But the point is that you can take it to court. So the idea that the Safe Life guy can take his windscreen fitters to court for not making effort when he has no evidence because he could not see what the worker was doing, that case would collapse. So that's the difference here. In the Safe Life case, the assumptions of the model are upheld because you cannot directly observe the performance of the individual. Here, the performance is directly observable, and so the relevance of the shirking model is invalidated.
Okay, there's a few other bits and bobs knocking around. There's Peter in the chat asking how many jockeys move from retained to non-retained status.
I think it's about 9. Robbie might have the number to hand.
Sorry, I don't have it to hand, Rob, but you're right. It's small. It's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of reinforces the superstar status.
Okay, thanks. And then Kerry perhaps says, reshirking in baseball, at least teams tend to overweight recent performances when making contract offers, so there is an incentive to shirk early on during a contract without hurting your future prospects. Perhaps retained jockeys improve later in the season to ensure that they are retained the following year, although that would require sub-annual data.
That's a good point. Very interesting. We don't know exactly at what point the retainer contract is awarded for the following season, but it would be interesting to track the performances through the season to get a handle on that. But that would need monthly data, race level data, which would be really hard to get.
Okay, and then we've got Wayne, I think, wanted to come back in with another question or comment.
Oh, no, actually, I was not.
Still familiar one. Okay, then Dennis?
Thanks. I have 2, I think, that are related points, and they came up based on something that Stefan said, and it's got nothing to do with shirking. I'm going to stay out of the shirking discussion. I have my own thoughts on it, but I'll keep them to myself. So, Rob, you have these guys, you have the jockeys, but do you have who the employers are of the jockeys? So, you got a two-sided market here where you've got the people offering their supply and you've got the hirers. And I know you don't have very many people that are retained, and even fewer that stop being retained who were retained. But this question about horse safety came up to mind here. If I'm a jockey that's just a unretained jockey, and then I get hired by some owner who then is putting pressure on me to mistreat the horse, that may be a situation where I decide not to be retained any longer. And so I wondered, with respect to this issue, do you have information, or is the information available in some way, about injuries to horses, and could you link injuries to horses to jockeys and to horse owners to see if there is some prevalence? That also comes to mind in the US context, because there's a huge number of horses that are dying at a track in California. I think Santa Anita or Santa Ana, would just several a year are getting put down. And it's been quite a big scandal. So anyways, that's what I wanted to throw out there.
That's really interesting. We don't know is the short answer. All we know is the length of time between races, which can be quite long, but isn't necessarily because of injury. Digging into the injury records, I guess it's reported in the Racing Post, but I don't know how systematic that would be. That again could be quite it requires some textual analysis, I think.
Thanks.
Very interesting point, though. And yeah, you're right. You can't take it for granted that these are reputable owners. I mean, I think they probably are, but they're going to treat the horses immaculately and so on. Although I would say that these owners have deep pockets, financial resources, so they certainly have access to the best veterinary surgeons. What I was thinking of in your question was how this matches up to the trainers, because it may be the trainers that are encouraging mistreatment rather than the owners. So if you like, there's another layer of the principal agent problem of what are the trainers doing here. And there have been cases in UK of trainers being reported to the authorities for mistreating horses, I believe. Robbie would know more about that.
You've gone beyond my the scope of my expertise, I think, Rob.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Dennis. Thanks, folks. Then Enya has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Short question regarding the prize money. So if it's what you pay, is it only in these races that prize money only gets paid to the one who wins the race, or is there prize money for example, the first three?
Thanks. Should have made that a bit clearer. The 6.9% is for winning, but there's also a prize money for the place. This depends on the number of horses in the race, the field. So it can be second, third, fourth. And obviously for a big race, it'll go to fourth. For a small race, it won't. And the jockey gets 3.9% of the prize money for a place. And that prize money is considerably less than for winning, of course.
Okay. So if we have the total earnings of a jockey, all these other rankings, except from the wins, they are included in their request.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes. The prize money we calibrate does include place money.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, then Stefan and Dennis have their hands up still. Are they for follow-up questions? Stefan's hand's gone. Dennis, yours is still there. That's gone now, but Bernd's hand has gone up. So Bernd, go ahead.
I'd like to come back to Enya's previous question. Are the handicaps known to the gamblers in advance?
Yes, all this stuff is widely known. Yeah, and it's written down in the Racing Post. Okay.
Is there any evidence that gamblers take this into account when placing their bets?
Ooh. I've not seen a study relating
handicap. Do you want me to come in there, Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bernd, the odds are reflective of the handicap. So, for example, in theory, the handicap should give horses an equal chance of success in the race, but that means the odds should be identical for every horse in theory. Yeah. But in reality, it doesn't look like that. So, what you might find sometimes is that when the odds are published, a horse that has a low handicap might be favourite, and it will then reveal information that maybe this horse has been very well handicapped because they appear to have a better chance based on the odds than the handicap should suggest. So the handicap is usually published 5-6 days in advance, maybe less depending on the race. And when the handicap becomes available, then the market forms. But some horses are what we'll say minded. So they're running races maybe that are not particularly suitable for 3 or 4 races in advance, with the idea that they'll target a race in the future, so that when they come to this race, they might have a favourable handicap rating. And as a consequence, the chances of them winning then are higher than they might otherwise have been.
So are there incentives to hold a horse back in a minor race in order to avoid a handicap in the next, perhaps more important race?
Sure, so it's a very good question. So it's against the rules, as I said, to deliberately hold a horse back, because that's why a jockey can get suspended. So what trainers might do is place the horse in a race where the conditions aren't suitable. So Rob mentioned the distance and the ground being two examples. So if you had a horse that likes to run over 3 miles, you might enter him in a 2-mile race, and then he won't run particularly well, or you might run him on ground that's too soft. In the hope that when the spring comes around, you might then enter him in a race that's more suitable in distance on better ground. So the horse might have 3 or 4 runs previously that season that look, pretty poor. And as a result, the handicap is lower. But the idea all along has been to target a particular race. So they enter the race then with particular conditions that are suitable on suitable ground. It has a low handicap weighting, and then wins the race quite comfortably. So that's a known tactic. It's not against the rules. It would be against the rules if you were deliberately holding the horse back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bert. And Enya has a hand up.
Yeah, quick question regarding that. So is the handicap adjusted after each race? So if the strategy is to let the horse run 3 poor races just to prepare for one important one, if the horse would win this race, would the handicap be adjusted right after?
Absolutely. So the handicap is constantly adjusted. So
Okay.
if a horse is performing badly, his rating will fall. And maybe sometimes this is a deliberate tactic. So when the rating falls, the handicap will fall. Now, if the horse then sort of reappears and appears to run way better than his rating would suggest, the handicapper would then immediately intervene after that. And the horse might go up 8, 10, 12 pounds in the handicap in the next race. So minding the horse's handicap is actually a very tricky skill, and it's a talent of good trainers if they can do this, because they can make reasonably average horses win big races because they get them in on a favorable handicap mark.
Okay, and the handicap is only the weight of the saddle and the jockey.
No, so not every race is a handicap. The best races have no handicap, so every horse runs off equal weights, and that's why they are the best races. But some of the most high-profile races are handicapped. So, like the English Grand National, for example, is probably the most high-profile race, certainly in this part of the world. So the top of the handicap would be 11 stone 12. So the jockey might be, say, 10 and a half stone. The saddle then would be an additional number of pounds, and if there's any shortfall, they put lead into the saddle to make up the difference. Now, I think relating to a question you mentioned earlier, anecdotally, it's believed at least the less lead you can have, the better. So it's better that the jockey is the weight rather than the lead. If that makes so, you're better off having a jockey of 11 stone 12 than a jockey of 10 stone with additional lead. It's just the lead is dead weight, whereas the jockey can move in theory up and down off the saddle potentially.
Yeah. The jockey can help by placing his weight.
Absolutely. Whereas lead appears to be at least harder to carry, even though the weight is identical.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Enya and Robbie. Any more questions and comments? Well, that was a thoroughly entertaining and interesting talk and discussion. So I'm going to make use once again of the new applause button. There we go. Bern has as well. A few of us applauding. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Rob, for a really interesting presentation. And we will be returning next week. We'll be back on Zoom next week. It's one of these joint sessions with the S Training Initiative, and the talk is by Manuel Stein of the University of Constance, looking at real-time skeleton detection for visual sports analysis and U. So please do join us for that. Details on how to join the Zoom meeting will be shared within the week, and 2 weeks' time, we'll return back to our Teams format for a talk by Peter Dalton at the University of Sussex on Is Football a Matter of Life and Death? But thanks once again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks, James.